Okay, the election was called this morning, and for people like me, that's a lot of fun, but I'm abnormal and my brain's not wired right. The first video I'd like to make is over the course of the election, we're going to hear nothing but the cost of living crisis, cost of living crisis, cost of living crisis. My proposition is that the cost of living crisis is just a poverty crisis. Um, Let me start with this first from QCOS. Cost of living crisis forces more Queensland children into poverty. Desperate parents are being forced to skip meals and feed their children cheaper, unhealthy meals to survive. A startling new report has found. The Queensland Council of Social Services 2024 Living Affordability Report reveals the devastating effects of the cost of living crisis is having on Queenslanders with low incomes, including working families. Um, the report lays bare how the crisis is depriving children of their childhood and parents unable to afford school camps, extracurricular activities, and meals for every person in the family. If you can't afford meals for every person in the family, here's some news for you: you're poor. It's not a cost of living crisis, you're poor. Sadly, this has become the more norm, and for more families, QCOS has said we are now seeing the generation of children growing up in poverty through no fault of their parents. As a child who grew up in poverty, who's now 55, I'd just like to point out it was no fault of my mother that I grew up in poverty. It was the system. That's not new. And QCOS should know better than to make such statements. They simply cannot afford to pay the necessities such as food, electricity, fuel, and rent. Well, that was my mother's issue too, and that's what poverty is, people. We shouldn't be judging why people are in poverty. We should be just accepting that people are in poverty and helping them get out of it. Our modelling shows that a single working parent is more than $150 in deficit in their budget each week, and that's correct. The report that was given to the government just before the budget this year recommended that a $150 rise be given to Social Security, and that should happen, but quite frankly, Social Security should double. That's where the Henderson poverty line is. So that's the report from QCOS. Now we're going to go to this report, which is Children Going Hungry, Missing School, and Australia's Perfect Storm, Cost of Living Crisis. This is how the media has changed poverty into this thing called a cost of living crisis. If children are going hungry and missing school, it's not a cost of living crisis. That's called poverty. This from The Conversation in Britain, which was written from somebody from London University. It's about Britain's situation, but it applies here as well, because what I'm talking about is the language, and that's right across the Western world, where we've stopped using the term poverty and changed it to the cost of living. But this is from The Conversation, British, the British one, not Australia's one. It's not a cost of living crisis, it's a poverty pandemic. Yes, I fully agree with that. This is from the Salvation Army Synagogue of New South Wales and ACT. Is the cost of living crisis just the new normal? Right, so even the people who want to fight poverty have just thrown everything up in the arms, decided to not call it poverty, and it's the cost of living crisis. but these people get grants off the government to service people who live in poverty. So if you stop saying that they live in poverty and it's just a cost of living crisis, all of a sudden it becomes something temporary. This is also from the Salvation Army. Surge in Australians sinking into extreme poverty amid the cost of living crisis. Again, we don't have a cost of living crisis. We have a poverty crisis. And all I can say is during the election, while everyone talks about the cost of living crisis, if you ever have an opportunity to be standing in front of a politician during this election and they start talking about a cost of living crisis, please call them out on their garbage and ask them, do they really mean the poverty crisis that's happening in Australia? Australia has 5.5 million people in this country on or below the poverty line. That's 1/5 of all Australians in this country are living in poverty. And it's a lot worse than that if you use 1970s mathematics, because from 1990 onwards, they've been changing the mathematics to diddle the books, which is how they can say 0.1 and 0.2% growth is good for the country. That's not growth. And that's how Albo can tell you that you're better off today than 3 years ago. That's how Albo can sit there and look you in the eye and tell you how everything's all going to be nice and rosy. Because in his fantasy world, it's going to be. In Dutton's fantasy world, it's going to be. Because they live in a fantasy world. They have the wealth and the privilege to live in a fantasy world. And they never ever associate with people like you and me. So they never ever understand that we have they fully understand we have a poverty crisis, because at some point everybody got together and decided to change it to a cost of living crisis. But it's a raw. Australia doesn't have a cost of living crisis. We have a poverty crisis. And we are back in the times of the Great Depression. And I don't care what the stock market's doing or what the dodgy unemployment figures show, that if you did 1 hour's work last week, you're not unemployed. 1/5 of this country is in poverty, and if we don't fix that, you won't need to worry about your rules-based order, because society will collapse. Gee, that's a nice happy way to end the video. Society's going to collapse. Society's not going to bloody collapse, because even if everything destroys itself on a community level, at least in the small town I live in, which has 2,000 people, I don't see 2,000 people here, but they say they have 2,000 people here. I suspect it's about 1,000 at the most. We'll work out our own systems if the system collapses. I don't know how people will go in the city. But yeah, life's not that bad. It's not as bad as I make it. I suffer from depression, so I always make it worse than it is. And if you watch my videos, you have to remember that. Please like and subscribe, and remember, if you're entitled to redress, chances are you will win a civil lawsuit. Please go and speak to lawyers who know what they're talking about when it comes to that. There's a big payout for them, and there's a big payout for you if it works out good. Everybody stay happy, and like I said, like and subscribe. Have a good day. Goodbye.